just running, pretending. I'm sitting down while running, it's not a valid form of exercise. Oh, hello. Guess what I've been doing this week? I've been reading Twitter. It's a big mistake. Nobody should ever do that. But while I was reading Twitter, came across this tweet. Take a look at that. Right, and it got me thinking, why do we bash Americans? And I don't mean we as in me and everyone else. And I don't just mean this, politically. There seems to be a tendency toward bashing Americans in general. Now, before I do continue, I should reiterate that, of course, this isn't all British people bashing all Americans all the time, but there is still, nonetheless, this tendency that happens there. And you wouldn't expect a restaurant to write this about other nations or other nationals from around the world, but somehow it's fair game with Americans, and that is something that I've never understood. Of course, now I understand it even less, having lived in America for 11 years and married to an American who would not take kindly to me saying such a thing. So, I just wanted to give some thought as to why we think it is fair game. In order to do so, we have to look historically at the relationship, the now apparently special relationship between Britain and America. And so, I think anti-American sentiment, if you want to call it that, among my British compatriots has existed for centuries. I mean, you could go back to the early colonization of what is now the United States. Even after that, take, for example, Samuel Johnson, the inventor of the original English dictionary in Britain. He was the precursor, I suppose, to Noah Webster in that sense. And, he had quite a strong anti-American sentiment to him. He's the very man, in fact, that said, I am willing to love all mankind except an American. And that's not all he said. I mean, that's not where it stopped. He also said, by his own choice, this was of somebody who would move to the continent of North America, or just the United States in general. By his own choice, he has left a country where he had a vote and little property for another where he has great property but no vote. And in many ways, that's sort of in line with King George III's idea that as a political entity, America had no hope, that it would go nowhere. And of course, then it did. It became independent from the British. You could almost argue that may have led to resentment, at least at that very time. I think if you were to talk to British people today, they may not even cite 1776 as a reason for their resentment against Americans, should they have that resentment. And that's quite an interesting point, right? So I'm not sure that all prejudice toward Americans today is even tied to history. In fact, to its detriment, it often ignores it. In the case of language, actually, quite often, as I've pointed out before, we ignore sort of the historical patterns behind language and how Americanisms came about from Britishisms. I've talked before about the word soccer having been coined actually in England, if you want to talk about lexicon. The same is true of certain spellings of words. Let's look at aluminum. We say and write aluminium back in the UK, and you say aluminum here. Well, aluminum was previously in use in the UK and was debated back and forth between members of the science circle there as to which one we should go with. And then similarly, when we're talking about pronunciation, a lot of Americans have a tendency to drop the H on herb, whereas the British tend to keep it, but that was not always the case. We started out by dropping the H on herb because of the French tendency to do so, just as we do with the words honour and hour and things of that ilk. But we stopped doing that just because it was becoming quite a class issue. If you were doing that in the UK, you were seen as unintelligent at one point. That memo never got spread over here in the United States, so they dropped it. And we ignore that fact when we criticise Americans from a linguistic point of view. And that's not where it ends. You could talk about sort of American stereotypes that have emerged. Americans are loud. We've talked about this before, but of course that is quite specific to certain things. And, just as it would be in reverse if we were to sort of stereotype my fellow countrymen for having bad teeth because of the depiction in Austin Powers, for example, not necessarily true of all British people. We do guide a lot of our things based on stereotypes. I'm talking now, of course, about the present day, having talked about the 18th century. But in between that, the relationship between the United States, or at least the political relationship between the United States and Great Britain, has changed, and specifically in and around World War II, when we sort of forged the aforementioned special relationship. You could still find quotes such as this, which was actually not by Winston Churchill. It's often said that Winston Churchill said it. He did not. There's no evidence for it. But the quote came out of somewhere. Somebody invented it. And so I think it's kind of a never-ending thing. But the big question is, why? Why do we bash Americans? We don't do this to people from other predominantly English-speaking countries like Australia or Canada. So we have to look at a couple of things. Firstly, America is a big dog in the world. It's the biggest dog, perhaps, in the world. Has been since World War II. We're very familiar with that idea. So in the present day, if we're ignoring history, as some are wont to do, are we simply looking at how America is a big dog and applying envy to that? Let's not forget, Britain also thinks of itself as sort of the greatest country in the world. It just uses different terminology. You know, it's very proud of what it's achieved, and rightfully so. I mean, we gave a lot to the world of music. We've given a lot to the world of technology, to the world of sport, etc., etc. And so when another country comes along and does all these things sort of bigger and grander and is itself extremely proud of its efforts, perhaps we look at that with a tinge of envy. I'd be lying if I said we didn't. And at the same time, there is respect. I think there is respect back in England for the United States. It's a weird sort of back and forth, a Jekyll and Hyde personality that we have toward America. But some other things, you know, through television and through media, we are granted, or rather given, an idea of what Americans are like. So we'll more than occasionally see news stories like this one. So when we see news reports like this, which I should say are very isolated but nonetheless very eye-catching and loud news reports, we have this tendency to assume, I think, through the frequency of it, that all Americans are like this, when in fact, through my own experience, I found it to be not the case at all. You know, I think most Americans that I interact with, while just like everyone else in the world may have their own neuroses that are unique to themselves and things of that nature, mostly aren't committing very bizarre crimes in Florida. I think that, you know, partly when we want to talk about British attitudes toward America, you have to remember that Britain just likes to moan. I mean, we do. We're a nation of moaners. I'm not a nation, but I am a moaner by nature because of, I think, my upbringing. But I tend to reserve that for things like the weather or the food that I'm about to eat tonight. It's not usually about a group of people from a nation, because let's remember that America is such a diverse nation that how could you really pigeonhole everybody into the same category? It can't be done. To that extent, it is impossible, I think, to bash Americans. You could bash a particular American for something terrible that he or she did, but to do it to a whole nation of people is very short-sighted in my view. But don't feel too bad about that, America, because we don't just reserve it for you. We do something very similar to the French, and for similar reasons as well, both linguistically based and also imperially based, historically speaking. So, you know, when I see a tweet like that I showed here at the beginning of the video, I almost wish I could encapsulate all of these thoughts into one video and reply to that tweet with said video. And now I can. I win. And so that is why we, /they/the British, don't slash the British. It's not the Revolutionary War. That's why the British bash Americans. Thanks for watching. Thank you for watching this episode of Lost in the Pond. Don't forget to hit my stupid little face to subscribe, and please share this video with the world. Hit me up on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, and if you would like to support this channel, please do so at patreon.com/lostinthepond.